Alright, welcome to the iceberg of the top 10, actually top 14, Chronomancers, tier list, challenge, gone wrong. Number 7 will shock you. Jokes aside, with 4 out of my 5 class guides being on calendar classes, and the writing being on the wall for the next one, I've kind of established myself as the Chronomancer guy. So it only makes sense for me to rank all the chrono classes released in AQ words so far, so you can find out what you should spend your aces on. Alright, I don't think I can keep up the excited YouTuber voice any longer, so let's get started. Starting with the 2011 original Chronomancer class, and it belongs in the S tier. Yep, that's right, the very first chrono class is still one of the best ones. And this is because of how I structure my tier list. It's not just about absolute damage output and the highest crits. It's about how useful the class is in everyday scenarios. And Chronomancer, also known as Chronomancer Prime, does one thing, and it does it well. Chronomancer was the first one to introduce the temporal rift stacking into rift collapse mechanic, also known as the Chronomancer nuke. And while future classes try to include some kind of additional gimmick in the class, Chronomancer kept it pure, just raw damage. The main use for a chrono class is nuking a boss so you get an instant kill. How quickly you can get to the kill depends on the cooldown of your nuke and how fast you can stack temporal rift. The cooldowns of Chronomancer are significantly lower than those of the competition. On top of that, you have the ability to nuke at only 3 stacks. This kinda depends on whether you're being buffed by your teammates and the health of the monster, but often you don't need a 4th stack. I know this is a very simple class. In fact, 2 of the 4 skills are barely used at all, but chain killing bosses is a real use case, and Chronomancer is good at it. One more positive is the additional crit chance on the nuke. Overall, Chronomancer and Chronomancer Prime, S tier. After that exciting start, however, we're gonna enter a bit of a lull period. Chrono Corruptor and Chrono Raptor. Yes, I did right! Chrono Corruptor and Chrono Raptor is not very strong. They really try to lean into the chaos theme when designing this class. And technically, they succeeded in that because the class is just too unreliable for general use. The nuking spell does have an even lower cooldown, it's just an issue of getting the stacks and the damage that feeds into the nuke in the first place. The class is heavily dependent on RNG, which is why it's sometimes used in speedrun strategies, where you can keep retrying until you get the right result. Outside of that though, there is no situation where I would rather use Chrono Raptor over Chronomancer Prime. Overall, D tier. Next one is 2013 Time Killer and Timekeeper. I'm actually biased against TK, because it's a boring version of ShadowStalker of Time, which is, spoilers, one of my favorite classes in the game. Timekiller does the same things as ShadowStalker, just with a bit less thinking involved. Back when its auto attack was able to give rift stacks, I would have had to put it in the S tier, but not anymore. One thing to keep in mind is that you might need to adjust how you build the class. You might care about getting 100% dodge, you are a thief class after all, but keep in mind that your crit chance also needs some attention, because your nuke is not guaranteed to crit. And I have to admit that not everybody has to read a college thesis for using a single AQ word class. So overall, Timekiller, Timekeeper, tier A. And with 2014, we see the introduction of Chrono Commander and also Chrono Commandant. And as I said earlier, there's a pattern of Chronomancer plus 1 gimmick, Chronomancer plus Chaos, Chronomancer plus Thief, and this time Chronomancer plus Tank. There was a brief period of time after the introduction of the first Ultra bosses where Chrono Commander was the go-to calendar class for damage and tanking. But after that we got Quantum and Paladin Chronomancer, so Chrono Commander got outclassed. Seriously, have you seen a CMD in the last 2 years? At least this class doesn't shoot itself in the foot like some of the other ones. C tier. Next one in 2015 is Chrono Dragon Knight, and just how awesome does that sound? Chrono Dragon Knight. There's also Chrono Data Knight. This class is the definition of a glass cannon. The nuke is absolutely massive, but it has no way to regain mana or health, and no tankiness at all. Chrono Dragon Knight is almost single-handedly responsible for the introduction of boss shields. If you weren't playing at the time, the strategy was to keep the Chrono Dragon Knight alive until it could nuke. The boss got deleted, and we could all go home. But boss shields are a thing now, and Chrono Dragon Knight fell out of flavor. So unless your goal is to get the absolute largest orange number on your screen, get a different class, C tier. Let us continue with Infinity Knight, also known as Interstellar Knight. The class is obviously bad. It's the only class whose nuke doesn't scale with damage dealt previously, meaning no exponential scaling. It also just takes forever to stack up, which is what I would have said before saying this. Listen, I'm not gonna tell you that the class is suddenly top tier, but you have to admit, killing these ultras so quickly with level 78 enhancement, no forge, no awe, is pretty impressive. We've been sleeping on this class as it kept getting buff after buff, and it's actually decent now, especially for the mid game. I'm gonna give it a C ranking because ultimately it's still nothing but damage, but so much of that damage flies under boss shields that the class is worth considering when you need DPS. Next up, the class I'm famous for liking, ShadowStalker, Stalker and Weaver of Time. Where do I even start? You get a loopable buff that lets you avoid all incoming attacks. You get 2 nukes in the form of DOTs that are actual chrono nukes. One of the fastest auto attacks in the game, combined with AoE skills when you don't want to switch to a proper farmer class. I will admit that some proper crit nukers can get higher hits, but due to the sheer flexibility of SSOT, I'm gonna confidently put it in the S tier. It's one of those classes that are at least decent, often top tier in all scenarios. Eternal, Immortal and Empyrean Chronomancer. Fun fact, this one and SSOT are the only chronos with 3 skins each, while the rest only have 2. Anyways, remember Chrono Dragon Knight? Imagine if you gave it some healing and a better mana model. Eternal Chrono does have the downside of taking kinda long to stack up its nuke, but once you do, it hits like an absolute truck. How often do you truly need to deal enough damage to delete not just a monster, but their entire bloodline? Not often, but when you do, pick this class. Eternal Chrono is a class I used to get 1 billion damage in solo play. Because of the low practicality though, I can only give it a B ranking. And now for the class that would justify the existence of the double S tier. Corrupted Chronomancer, also known as Timeless Chronomancer. Where do I even start with the class that made the world's greatest fan of ShadowStalker put it in the bank? This class is really a 2-in-1, with transience and power offering different playstyles. Permanent max dodge, combined with one of the biggest rift modifiers, that is, how much you scale your built-up damage by when you press the nuke. The class is admittedly difficult to use, but this is a tier list on practicality and value, not ease of use. Easily S tier. If you're willing to put in the effort to learn it, then get this class immediately. Overworld and Underworld Chronomancer shares the same skill set and hourglasses as Corrupted, but uses timepieces as opposed to corruptions. With the introduction of forge enhancements, such as Dauntless, the gap between the two classes has closed a bit, but Overworld still suffers from the same issue. It's good in a vacuum, but you never really have a reason to use it over Corrupted. B tier. Speaking of good in a vacuum, we've got Necrotic Chronomancer and Necronomancer. Top tier farming class, genuinely really good. The issue is that we also have non-calendar farmers, such as Legion Revenant and Archmage. If you don't have one of those, then NCM is probably the fastest way you can progress your account. But once you do get farming classes, you'll feel like you should have spent your money on a calendar class that offers something that you can't get anywhere else. B tier. Quantum Chronomancer and Continuum Chronomancer. Remember the Nuker plus gimmick system? NCM was Nuker plus farmer, QCM is Nuker plus support. Don't get me wrong, it still has a nuke and great damage output, but the point of getting this class is its survivability in ultra rooms and its ability to buff teammates. It does a pretty good job at it and makes boss fights way quicker. A tier. Paladin Chronomancer, Obsidian or otherwise. Gimmick, Nuker plus healer. Minus Nuker. The class doesn't crit, has bad mana sustain, and because the free skill doesn't target enemies, Elysium isn't an option either. On the other hand, its health scaling makes it an absolute unit to deal with, and you can find a damaging build with high tier Forge. An extremely tanky ultra fighter, with the only downside being the fact that Archpaladin can fill the exact same role. Overall A tier. Chrono Shadowslayer and Hunter. I uploaded my CSS guide before finishing this video, which is why I seem to struggle counting to 6. The class itself is a dodge-based nuker, not unlike TK. It's not as convenient to use, but it also deals more damage to anything with a boss shield. A tier. Now you might have noticed that I don't actually own all of these classes. You could assume that I know what I'm doing, and the reason I don't have the classes is that they're bad. There is definitely a correlation between whether I own the class and how high I rated them. But because I evaluated them purely based on game sense, the wiki, and the opinions of other players, it's more likely that something has slipped my radar. So let me know in the comments which class you think I'm wrong about, and why. Also keep in mind that some of these classes would have probably gone up a tier if it weren't for at least one other class that does the same thing, either better or cheaper. Now, what should you get as your first and possibly only chrono? I would rule out anything tier B and below. I also wouldn't pick any of the ultra fighters. So I recommend you pick one of these four, and if you still can't decide, pick Timekeeper. Thank you so much for watching.